us tonight as we approach the kind of last 5 or 6 weeks of this trimester, and no cheering from the students out there. I want to share with you a couple of thoughts before I introduce Tom from recent testimony given by Vice Admiral Tom Wilson, who is the director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, before the Congress. I'm going to paraphrase his thoughts. Most of us believe that the post-Cold War period ended on 11 September. The next decade or so may well be defined by the struggle over globalization. Values and concepts long championed by the United States and the West, political and economic openness, democracy and individual rights, market economics, international trade, scientific rationalism, and the rule of law are being carried forward on the tide of globalization. Money, people, information, technology, ideas, goods, and services moving around the globe at higher speeds and with fewer restrictions. Our adversaries increasingly understand this link. They equate globalization to Americanization and see the U.S. as the principal architect and primary beneficiary of an emerging order that they believe undermines their values and their interests, their beliefs, and their culture. They blame the U.S. for what is wrong in the world and seek allies among states, groups, and individuals who worry about overwhelming U.S. strength and are unhappy with the present or perceived future. They are adept at using globalization's downsides, demographic and economic imbalances, large numbers of unemployed youth, Western culture proliferation, declining living standards, corrupt and ineffective governments, decaying infrastructure. They use these to foster an extremist message and attract recruits and support among globalization's losers. The 11 September terrorist attacks were the wake-up call that we needed to realize we are in a war against the U.S. vision of the future world order. They targeted our homeland, but also struck a blow against global openness, the global transportation network, and the global economy. These extremists and their allies understand that their desired world cannot coexist with our brand of civilization. Encouraging, furthering, and consolidating the positive aspects of globalization while reducing and managing its downsides and defeating its enemies may well be the civilized world's measure of merit for the next decade. And that brings us to our lecture tonight. Professor Tom Barnett is currently double-hatted, and he's working in the OSD Office of Force Transformation for my predecessor, Admiral Art Zebrowski. He is also a senior strategic researcher in our Center for Naval Warfare Studies here at the college. In the latter role, he serves as director of the New Rule Sets Project, an ambitious effort to draw maps of how power and influence could change in the 21st century. His effort is aimed at expanding the U.S. military's, and specifically the Navy's, vision of where and how it can wield maximum influence in what is an emerging era of globalization. Prior to this study, Dr. Barnett directed the Y2K International Security Project, and in his current work, he is examining the concept of the system perturbations and its applicability to our strategy, and its implications as to the direction in which U.S. forces and our Navy must evolve. Prior to joining the Naval War College in August 1998, Dr. Barnett served as a project director at the Center for Naval Analyses. During his 8 years at CNA, he directed projects or worked as an analyst in a variety of subject areas, publishing several different reports and essays and annotated briefings. His major accomplishments included serving as a member of the Naval Capabilities Planning effort that developed the new strategic concepts that eventually were published in the Navy's white paper, From the Sea, the first draft of which he helped author. Along with proceedings, Dr. Barnett has written articles for the Washington Post and the Christian Science Monitor and published a book on Romanian and East German policies in the Third World. He has a BA with honors from the University of Wisconsin with a major in Russian language and literature and a major in international relations. At Wisconsin, he was elected to the Phi Beta Kappa in his junior year. Following Wisconsin, Dr. Barnett earned an MA in regional studies specializing in Russia, Eastern Europe, and Central Asia, and then a PhD in political science from Harvard University. While at Harvard, he served as research assistant to the director of the Russian Research Center, the renowned Professor Adam Ulam, and he worked as a teaching fellow in the history and government departments. Before I welcome Tom to the podium, I'd like to again acknowledge the continued assistance of the Naval War College Foundation, and specifically the generosity of the Captain Robert N. Miller Memorial Foundation for their support of this event. Professor Tom Barnett is a visionary. He knows how to express his views with facts and conviction. Challenge him. Ask him a hard question. We at the War College are extremely pleased that he has agreed to address us here tonight. Please join me in welcoming Professor Tom Barnett.
Thank you very much. Frankly, one of the things that drove me out of Washington, D.C. was the allergies. So I'm excited to be anywhere alive and awake at 7:30 at night, because most nights this is pretty hard for me. I was born the 8th of 9 children in a very large family, the 6th of 7 sons. I grew up in a world where everybody was bigger than me and had all the power. And so I learned from a very early age the only way I could get anything was to plead, was to beg, was to ask, was to cajole. Another thing I learned was to be, in effect, genetically predisposed to seek out older males for advice, for counsel, for wisdom, because I was surrounded in a family of older males. Before I start tonight, I'd like to first cite 5 individuals whose interactions with me over the last 4 or 5 years really shape all the ideas and concepts I'm going to present here tonight. This, in many ways, is a culminating brief describing a 5-way discussion that I've had for several years now with all these individuals. Each of them a very strong big brother, father figure, mentor in my life. First person I'd cite is Professor Brad Hayes, senior decision researcher in the Decision Strategies Department. Brad is a truly gifted individual, beautiful mind, a real mentor in my life. He was the first guy who came up to me after that story appeared in the Newport Daily News last Monday. Put his arm around me very gently in that fatherly fashion of his, and he said, "Tom, I always knew you were an ass." He said, "But now I know you're a pompous ass." And he said, "I love you all the more." He said, "But don't stop there. You're almost 40. With any luck, in a couple of years, you'll have a massive midlife crisis, and then you can achieve the goal of all middle-aged American males." I said, "What was that?" He said, "You can become a complete ass." Brad always looks on the bright side. Second person I'd like to cite is Dr. Lawrence Modisette. Lawrence is my boss in the Decision Strategies Department. I've said it before, I'll say it again. Lawrence is the best boss I've ever had. His only problem is his managerial skills are so great, it really hides the fact that he's a world-class analyst. And I think he's underappreciated in that regard. Third individual I'd like to cite is Dr. Henry Gaffney, Hank Gaffney at the Center for Naval Analyses. If CNA was my residency after I got my PhD at Harvard, this guy was the chief resident, and in many ways has been the chief resident in terms of my intellectual education and growth over the last 15 years. I'd like to cite also Bud Flanagan, retired 4-star. He went from Sinkland Fleet in Norfolk to become a senior partner at Cantor Fitzgerald. He's the one who brought us the New Rule Sets project. Everything I've learned in terms of globalization, the rise of markets, how finance works, I learned literally at this guy's knee. He's a tremendous father figure in my life, and I care for him very deeply on that basis. And then finally, obviously I'd cite Art Zabrowski. It's hard to say anything new or original about a guy who's literally a legend in his own time, kind of a Hyman Rickover of his age. Art and I got together under very unusual circumstances. One of his first acts when he came to the War College was actually to hire me. It was a smart move, I think, on his part, but he didn't know who I was, frankly. He just signed a piece of paper. And I was trying to think of some splashy way to introduce myself to him. And what I came up with was an article that I sent off to the U.S. Naval Institute Proceedings. It was entitled, "The 7 Deadly Sins of Network-Centric Warfare." Now, for the people in the naval community who know Art Zebrowski, they know that he is the father of network-centric warfare. Now, I thought this was kind of a cute approach. I didn't realize at the time that Art is a very serious Catholic. He's what I call a big R, big C Roman Catholic. He literally goes to Mass every day, like my parents, like I did through grade school. And I guess the whole deadly sins thing didn't go over so well with him. I had been invited to his office a lot as a bright young star early in his tenure, and then I noticed when the article came out, the invitation stopped. Well, I kept a low profile, and a couple months after this article came out, I was called into his office with a bunch of other professors. There he was, standing on the far side of the office, staring at me with those steely, gray, Vulcan-like eyes. After a long pause, he came over, stood in front of me, and said quietly, "I'm waiting." Just like my mother used to say, "I'm waiting." I screwed up my courage. I looked him straight in the eye, and I said, "For what?" For an explanation, a rationale, an apology? He leaned closer and solemnly intoned, "For your confession." God, that man knew how to get under my skin right from the start. As a long-time altar boy, I knew exactly what I had to do at that point. I dropped and gave him 40 on the spot. Hail Marys, that is. And as we pushed that original sin behind us, we developed a very warm and fruitful relationship. He has literally, figuratively, in every sense of the word, elevated my thinking tremendously in the last 4 years. I wouldn't be who I am, where I am, doing what I am if it wasn't for him. And so he's a huge influence in my life. I like to think of myself as a stand-up philosopher. That was actually the description I offered that lady from the Newport Daily News. She didn't get it. I said, "Stand-up philosopher. I coalesce the vapors of human existence into a coherent comprehension." A bullshit artist, basically. This is the actual joke that Phil Hartman gave to Jay Leno the last time he appeared on The Tonight Show in 1999 before he died. I use it because it gives you a sense of the goal of my talk here tonight. Over the next 60 minutes, what I want to accomplish is basically the answer to the question, what did Buddha say to the hot dog vendor? I'll tell you what Buddha said to the hot dog vendor. Make me one with everything. That's what we're shooting for. The reason why it's important, from my perspective, to think as absolutely big picture about 9/11 is I think we got some serious signals about the future of change in the international security environment, about the nature of conflict in the international security environment. I think we got a big glimpse at the underlying struggles connected with the process of economic, political, social, technological globalization. I think it tells us a lot about where we need to take our military in terms of transformation. And I know this is a very difficult subject that a lot of people are struggling with. These are the best ideas I've been able to come up with in a series of conversations with about 40 or 50 individuals over the last 6 months. But this very much builds on really a 4 to 5 year conversation I've had with all those individuals I named earlier, and especially with Art Zebrowski. This began with the year 2000 International Security Dimension Project, when we asked, what would a big, scary event look and feel like for a network society? And you can go back and read that report. Amazingly, we predicted a lot of things that didn't happen on January 1st, 2000, but did happen the days and weeks following September 11th. A sense of where we come from in terms of marching orders we think we have, Art Zebrowski and I, from Don Rumsfeld. The basic notion we have is we got to move faster in the current, and the current is moving ever so fast right now. George Bush has said this several times. We must change the way we fight to win this war, ergo, this war allows us to change the way we fight. Donald Rumsfeld's op-ed, November 1st, Washington Post, Beyond This War on Terrorism. He laid down two markers. He said, first, obviously, we got to win this war. Second, we got to start preparing for the next. And you got to remember, this is when the op-ed pundits were nipping at his heels, saying he didn't realize what he'd gotten us into in Afghanistan. This is before it all turned. So it was a big point on his part to lay down this marker and say, not only do we fight this war, but we have to understand what this war tells us about the future and begin constructing that kind of architecture now. So I say military transformation pathway, somewhat sharpened. Near term, you go with what you got in the pipeline. You get rid of that concept of low density, high use. But long term, you start asking yourself, what has this experience taught us about a security environment that we may be living with for decades? We exported security into Europe, into Japan for 40 or 50 years. And by doing so, we solved two of the biggest security issues of the 20th century. German militarism, Japan militarism. By exporting that security for half a century, we took care of the third big problem of the 20th century, Russian aggression. The question is, what do we want to take care of in this century? What are the big goals we want to achieve? The historical analogies, you've seen these before. We compare, win this one to 1941. People like to compare the World Trade Center attacks to Pearl Harbor in terms of the shock. Obviously not the same mobilization. We're a different society now. But in terms of the shock, the same wake-up call that says, hey, pay attention to things you haven't been paying attention to, we think it's very similar. But when we're talking about win the next one, here we have to make the leap. Here we have to engage in the kind of thinking that those wise men engaged in at the end of the Second World War when they looked ahead and said, hey, what do we want to have 40, 50 years down the road? We know we want to wait out a Soviet Union. We know we want to rebuild a global economy. We know we want to focus on Western Europe and Japan and North America. And you know, they made that dream come true. And they created a national security establishment to facilitate that dream. And so the questions we ask are really about, how do you get between those two numbers? Those are huge dates in American history. I've been reading a lot of Stephen Ambrose to cover the time period. It goes kind of fast because he doesn't use a lot of footnotes, I found out. I've since switched to Shelby Foote. He's really terrible. He has lots of footnotes on the Civil War. But the kind of questions we ask to jump from 41 to 45. What are the new rules for international security? What's the best security structure for this government? What is the definition of new normalcy for US society? Do we travel as far as a London, perhaps, which after the IRA bombings of the 1970s and 80s basically erected a structure where today you can walk from one end of London to the other and be on camera the entire time? Or do we travel as far as in Israel, where you take your kids to the mall on a Saturday, and while they check out the latest DVDs, you have the gas masks, the family gas masks, refreshed? How far are we willing to travel? How much can we take in terms of a different kind of normalcy? A lot of people think we're watching the future of warfare, the future of terrorism right now in the West Bank and in Israel. A sense of this concept of rule sets and how we've defined it. I drew this slide with Art Zebrowski 4 years ago. When we first started briefing this, people said, wow, you guys are a little apocalyptic, bit of a messiah complex. To which I always responded, your point? I like to say I live in the greatest country in the world. I work for the best government in the world. I'm associated with the best military in the world. I'm employed by the best military higher education institution in the world. I don't walk through these doors each and every day to collect a paycheck or a pension. I walk through these doors to change the world each and every day. So you bet I have a messiah complex. Here's how I explain the 20th century in 60 seconds. Pay attention. People say watching me give a brief is like watching a farmer try to stuff 30 pounds of manure into a 10-pound bag. I'm going to talk about Globalization 1, roughly from 1875 to 1929, when I can say somewhat facetiously, we screwed the pooch one afternoon on Wall Street. We called it Black Friday. We engendered a systemic stress. We called that the Great Depression. From the Great Depression came World War II. Why? You don't get a Hitler elected in Germany in 1933 without the Great Depression. At the end of World War II, we said we were going to firewall ourselves off from that experience. Not just the Holocaust, never again, but the economic nationalism of the 1930s, which killed this first great coming together of the global economy. We instituted what we describe as a new rule set. We created institutions, strategies, flows of resources. The International Monetary Fund, the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, which becomes the WTO, the United Nations, NATO, the Bretton Woods Agreement, the whole shebang, Marshall Plan, containment, all designed to keep the Western democracies talking to one another, prevent the Soviet bloc from dividing and conquering us. But the implicit goal was the resurrection of the global economy. We succeeded beyond our wildest dreams. Larry Summers, now president of Harvard, will say that's the story of the second half of the 20th century. Not the Cold War. That was an enabling factor, a crucial factor. But the real accomplishment, the real peace dividend of that time period was the recreation of the global economy based on Japan, Western Europe, the United States. 10% of the global population, 70% global GDP, 70% long-term investment flows around the world. Absolutely amazing. They envisioned a world, they created a security structure, they developed a strategy, they followed it, they changed the world. I think we're at a similar point in history. When we first drew this slide, we started to ask. The Berlin Wall comes down, seemingly everybody, all of a sudden, 1990, on the same page, adopting the same rule set regarding economic behavior and activity. We start to ask ourselves, do new sorts of stresses begin to appear in the 1990s, which begin to call into question what was a new rule set for the late 1940s, early 1950s, now starts to look a little long in the tooth, because that rule set was created to prevent the collapse of this sort of globalization, prevent this sort of great power war paradigm, not to further the advance of this sort of globalization, which I would argue is qualitatively, quantitatively different. Labor much more rigid in terms of flow. Money much more fluid, for example. First big hint, I had new stress. Mexican pesos crisis, 1994. I was working for CNA at the time, Center for Naval Analyses. I sent a memo to Bob Murray, the president. I said, I don't know what it is, I just think it's really important. And that was enough for my paycheck that week. Other big hints. The Asian flu, 97, 98. The rise of rapid climate change, the rise of global computer viruses. When we first drew this slide, we said, what could come down the pike? And this is where people said we were kind of apocalyptic. That would be like a World War II, where we would find ourselves firewalling ourselves off from some wilder, earlier experience. The analogy, 1990s, 1920s. Try selling that in 1998. Business cycle. The law of the business cycle at that point had been repealed. Everybody had gotten 30% on their mutual funds for so long they forgot you could ever have a depression. This was before Enron, before all the scandals. Now, when we first drew this slide, we drew it for Y2K. We wondered if that could be a catalytic event. Then we became interested in the tech crash. With 9/11, I got no problem drawing this line. If you're reading the newspaper every day, you are seeing new rule sets being proposed all the time for how we interact as citizens, for the nature of privacy, for the nature of warfare, for the nature of legal rights in this system. Most of these rule sets are not being put up for a vote. They will be tested in court for decades. But your whole world is changing on the basis of 9/11. It's pinging all the boxes, rule sets appearing daily. But it's not just enough to focus on closing the door on those crazy, hazy 1990s, when in effect we got a little sleepy at the wheel. We really have to back this thing down and ask ourselves, what are we trying to create as we look ahead to the next century? What future do we seek? What do I want to see in 2050? I'll be 88 years old. At that point, I will have remanufactured, reseeded, replaced, regrown most of my body parts. I'll be looking at the second half of my life, most of which I don't intend to spend on this dusty planet. But what do we want to seek? The concept of asymmetrical warfare. It's used, abused, employed all the time. Here's my take on it. I'm going to give you a three-tiered paradigm for looking at an essential question of human history. Why are wars caused between states? I'm citing Ken Waltz, classic of international relations theory, Man, the State, and War. He developed a three-tiered perspective looking at the issue nation-state war. He said, I'll look at it sort of from the bottom up. I'll blame it. First image, he said, human nature. Man's inherently violent. You have bad leaders, a Hitler, a Milosevic, a Saddam. That's why you have wars. First explanation. Second explanation. You say you have good states, bad states. Democracies on average start wars less. Authoritarian governments on average start wars more. Actually, governments going from authoritarian to democracy start wars the most. It's sort of a teenagerdom for states. Tom Friedman came up with this genius concept not too long ago, about 4 or 5 years ago. He said, I realized that no two countries with a McDonald's franchise within their borders had ever gone to war in human history. He dubbed it the Golden Arches theory of conflict prevention. He went to McDonald's. They have databases on everything at their headquarters in Chicago, and they said, you're absolutely right. So he publishes his very famous book describing globalization, The Lexus and the Olive Tree, and he says no two countries in human history have ever gone to war if they have a McDonald's franchise within their borders. Absolutely true, until NATO bombed Serbia. Tom Friedman came out with a new edition. Slightly enlarged chapter. He said, read the fine print. I said, civil wars don't count. Yugoslavia, civil war. NATO, he said, not a country. Smart. I sent Mr. Friedman an email. I said, I've been to the McDonald's in Belgrade. It was the worst Big Mac I ever had. I don't think it counts. Here's a better one for you military officers. I got this off an airplane one time, Golf Digest. No two countries with more than 100 golf courses per 1 million people have ever gone to war in human history. Look it up, believe it. This island should be the center of world peace. I gave this brief to a bunch of military flags, Marine Corps generals. One of them leaned over the table. He said, that's the Air Force strategy for ruling the world. All these things say the same thing. You get to a society to a certain level of socioeconomic development, they tend to get out of the violence game. I can count 37 major crises or conflicts in the 1990s. You look them up in terms of their per capita GDP, you will find that all of them, except for a couple, Northern Ireland, the Chiapas revolutionaries in Mexico, all of them are low income or low middle income. You get a country above $3,000 per capita per year, they get out of the violence business. And I've done a lot of consulting with USAID, U.S. Agency for National Development, over the course of my career. I will tell you the simplest way to get that to happen, educate young girls, stop them from having kids early in life. And boom, they're out of the violence business. You go up on top here, you say, the reason why we have conflict in the system is there's no Leviathan stopping states from going to war. Kind of explains my children every time I turn my back on them. Like Thomas Hobbes' description of life without a Leviathan, they're rather nasty, brutish, and short. Constantly fighting till I step in. Okay? We take this three-tiered perspective, we look at the nature of globalization. The basic argument I've been making for a long time, militaries tend to be frozen in the nation-state image. When they look around the world, all they see are nation-states. I call this the Willie Sutton effect. Willie Sutton was the bank robber who was asked, why do you rob banks? He said, that's where the money is. Smart. The reason why militaries look around the world and only see nation states is because that's where the money is. Concentrated in the forms of levies, taxes, whatever, to create the instruments of big violence we call the military. The problem is, most of the power and competition have moved up to the interstate level. Most of the violence and the threats have moved subnational. Global defense spending by countries peaked in 1987, dropped 40% almost immediately with the Berlin Wall, flat ever since. Same thing with global arms transfers. Meanwhile, acquisition of small arms around the world skyrocket. 500 million small arms in the world, according to the UN. Good news is 200 million right here on American streets. So we win that arms race too. It's good to be rich. But we're talking about all the private security firms down here. We're talking about all the massive efforts to create secure lines of communication, all those financial markets around the world. I could argue we're spending as much on security, probably more, than we did in 1987. We're just not concentrating the activity so much at the level of the government. Private security industry in this country, $25 billion a year. It is growing leaps and bounds. Before I die, it'll be bigger than the Defense Department. Absolutely. Meanwhile, we spent most of the 90s fixating on those rogues, those 5 states, Libya, North Korea, Iran, Iraq, Syria, and their access to WMD. Certainly an important issue. You stack those 5 economies end to end, though, you don't have much of a picture of globalization. You're staring at a tiny corner of the world. Frankly, it wouldn't matter at all if it wasn't for the natural gas and the oil in Iraq and Iran. So we say, in effect, we got a military that's built for fighting other nations. But the market of security has gotten so much more fractured. National Defense University, in their landmark study on globalization, they describe this as the governance gap. You're built for one kind of governance structure, but the market's gotten so much more complex. Some of the reasons why this governance gap has appeared. So what did we see on 9/11? We talk about the super-empowered individual. That's Tom Friedman's concept, Lexus and the Olive Tree. He named bin Laden as the super-empowered individual. Bin Laden, when he declared war on America in 1996, he didn't declare war on the United States. He declared war on American citizens. He said, I want to kill as many American citizens as possible. And he did it on 9/11, sending suicide bombers, killing the largest number of Americans since the Battle of Antietam, the second day, Sharpsburg. That's how long it's been since that many Americans died. And the best part was we all got to watch it live on television. Because that's the way they planned it. They wanted all of us to watch 3,000 or 4,000 people die live on television. Up on top here, we got a transnational network, Al-Qaeda. They're not interested in taking us on directly. They want to trigger a systemic perturbation. They attack the icons of globalization. My New Rule Sets project, it was all about bringing the Pentagon and the World Trade Center together. The partner was Cantor Fitzgerald. The project shot out from under me, literally on 9/11, because most of the people connected with it are dead now. They were trying to attack symbols of what we represent, and they did an amazing job. Now you can cynically draw a line between these two and say, thank God it ran through Afghanistan. Nobody liked those people anyway. So the knee-jerk response, bomb them. But of course it's a lot more complex than that. We're fighting a network war all across the world against these guys. Bank account by bank account, US Treasury jump teams, FBI, the whole package. They've taken $100 million off the table from about 200 groups or individuals. This is a major new form of warfare. Treasury didn't do this before. Nothing like this. Down here, we're talking all the special operations, cave by cave. FBI guys running in with SEALs and Green Berets. Amazing stuff. Very integrated, all parts of the US government working. We have not seen this kind of warfare before. Don Rumsfeld will tell you flat out, no op plan for this. No plan on the shelf to do this package. Nobody imagined this package. Frankly, we did on Y2K. And we were accused of being nuts for it. But we were talking about what happens when a real shock happens to a network society like the United States. That's what we were groping for. Blindly, frankly. So when I talk about this fractured market, when I describe these concepts, especially this concept I'm going to talk about in depth, the system perturbation, in many ways, I'm searching for a gut, a grand unifying theory that ties together asymmetrical warfare, virtual warfare, cyber warfare, military operations other than war, the whole shebang. We're trying to create a new language. We are trying to reinvent the wheel. Battle lines in this war. People may be surprised at the level of energy, resources we're going to pour into Central and Southwest Asia over the next 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 35, 40 years. I will tell you, this started long ago. In the 1950s and 1960s, our deployments and our crisis response patterns were in sync. We were all about making sure the Soviets didn't expand. So we had troops and we had crisis response activity in Europe. We had troops and we had crisis response activity in Northeast Asia. It was called the Korean War. It was called the Vietnamese War. Okay? Come the 1970s, everything starts to change. This is when this whole show began. 4 big events. First, you got the détente in Europe. You got the 73 war. I can show you the crisis response data from EUCOM, European Command. It shifts right to the Eastern Med over the 1970s. You got the end of the Vietnam War. You got the fall of the Shah of Iran, a pivotal event in that century's history, I would argue. And I can show you the data from PACOM, Pacific Command. They used to have lots of responses on that side. Then they all started shifting over to the Middle East. By the time you got to the 1980s, that's the bulk of the security market. There was no surprise when they created CENTCOM. The market had simply migrated there. Naval response crisis days, count them up in the 1980s. 3 out of every 4 focused on the Middle East. That's 75% of your market. We were still very much focused on the Soviets at this point, but that's where the market had gone. All the signals were there. Bush administration came in, very much focused on, we're going to get much tougher on China. We're going to look at them at the near peer. We're going to reorient a security strategy towards Northeast Asia. All that gets wiped away with 9/11. And I say, good. I'm going to draw you a map of the world. I will tell you, this is a map that got the most interest from Rumsfeld's deputies about a month ago when I gave a brief to them in SecDef's conference room. And it was really intriguing to me why they were so interested in this. People refer to this as the jelly donut slide. I'm going to draw you a map of the world that's different from most people's maps. I'm going to describe parts of the world that are functioning within the process of globalization. That means they accept both the connectivity of globalization and they can handle the content flows that come with it. All the Britney Spears, all the commercial pornography, the whole shebang, they can handle it. Because they got legal systems, they got mature societies that can handle nasty stuff in effect. Functioning within globalization doesn't mean every day sweet and happy, doesn't mean they don't have recessions. It means they're not fighting globalization. They're aligning their internal rule sets with the external global rule set represented by globalization. Those functioning areas, North America, Europe definitely. I would include Russia under a Putin, coastal areas of China, obviously South Korea, Japan. I'd include India, half the world's software. I'd include Australia. I'd include South Africa. I'd include the Southern Cone, the ABC countries of South America, although, of course, Argentina having a bit of an Enron moment right now. But they should have known they couldn't have gotten away with it for too long. I draw a big circle around that. I say that's the functioning core. I could show you a great map from the New York Times last Sunday. What I just drew you, all those countries, 10 to 25% of the population over 60. Okay, remember that. 10 to 25% of the population over 60. That functioning core. Now I'm going to draw you the messy middle. And I first drew this messy middle on the basis of tracking U.S. naval crisis responses in the 1990s. Non-combat evacuations, relief, contingency positioning, show of force, combat. This is where we did our business in the 1990s. I said I'm going to draw a line around 90% of it. I'm not going to include what I think are rather isolated cases in Northeast Asia. A little bit of scary business, virtual warfare off the coast of Taiwan, North Korea acting up now and then. I'm going to include that as my messy middle, and I'm going to call that the non-integrating gap. These are countries that are losing out to globalization, unable to keep up with globalization, can't handle the content flows that come with globalization. Like much of the Middle East, like much of Islamic society. So I say this is a different map of the world. What you discover is, if you're fighting against or losing out to globalization, this is where the US military tends to go. And if you're not fighting globalization, then you should be part of the solution set, because you're not the places we tend to go. So it becomes very clear to me when I look at 9/11, the nature of conflict, it's all about globalization. Remember I said the outer ring, 10 to 25%, 60 and over? That mess in the middle, less than 10%, 60 and over. It's a demographic breakdown. That's where the young are. This is where the older are. The concept of containment, how it switches or changes or is altered as we move from Cold War to globalization era. I'm going to make a basic argument here. It's kind of a Hegelian flip. In the Cold War, basically up on the system level, we had a fairly rigid bipolar order. Okay? We were concerned about zero-sum shifts against the United States. If they moved into country A, we had to move into country B. If they liked Ethiopia, we liked Somalia. If they decided they liked Somalia more, we switched over to Ethiopia. Back and forth, all around the world. Okay? What we were really concerned about, they expand their influence so much, in effect, our way of life is put at risk. They weren't just about expanding their empire, they were about eliminating our way of life. So in effect, I say we firewalled off that sacred thing. We fought these guys tooth and nail, country by country, system global competition throughout 50 years. Now I do the flip. Let's go to the globalization era. I think on 9/11, super-empowered individuals showed that they can affect serious zero-sum shifts against the United States. 19 guys, $500,000 in outlay. About $1 trillion of damage to the US and global economy. I say they changed world history in so many ways we're going to be counting it up for decades. And I say if you think we licked the problem because we kicked them out of Afghanistan, don't kid yourself. I can raise $500,000 on credit cards in about 2 weeks. You give me 15, 20 young military officers willing to sacrifice their life, I could pull off the World Trade Center. I don't need Afghanistan to do that. That's the scary part about this. You got people willing to die on a little cash, and you're smart enough and patient enough, you can do some major damage. I say what we should really be concerned about is our way of life writ large. We cannot live the way we live without globalization. Don't kid yourself. And I think we saw that in the Doha round, the meeting of the WTO in Qatar in December, where in effect they said, hey, we're going to firewall off globalization. You're not going to ruin this great process of human integration. We're going to make sure. So instead, we're going to fight individuals around the world, bank account by bank account, safe house by safe house, cave by cave. Very different warfare. And it changes the definitions of deterrence. In the Cold War, I would argue deterrence is fairly simple. It's us against the Russians. Basically, they were unwilling to risk regime control over their population. They thought time was on their side in a global conflict. They were unwilling to risk it all, single roll of the die, one afternoon. They were Marxist-Leninists. Very different now. How do you deter these rogues? That one seems pretty simple. We call it the Bush Doctrine. Harbor terror in any form, and eventually we're going to get around to you. But how do you deter the super-empowered individual? How do you deter the transnational network? How do you deter this guy when he doesn't have a regime to preserve? He's a real nihilist. How do you preserve these guys when they don't think time is on their side? The 17th century paradise these guys want to create in Saudi Arabia, they've got a limited window of opportunity. Very limited, I could argue. You look at Saudi youth 20 years ago, you look at them today, you imagine Saudi youth in 20 years, that country won't be there in 20 years for them to turn back to the 17th century. They know it. That's why they're going to get more desperate. Definition of new crisis. I'm going to talk about vertical versus horizontal scenarios. This is something I learned at Hank Gaffney's side. These are basically his concepts originally. The vertical scenario that I learned about when I came to CNA in 1990. This is the classic military way of thinking. Vertical scenario. Something that just comes out of the sky, hits you one day. The descriptions. It unfolds with lightning speed. It's always completely without warning. Always. Opponents are known beforehand. We knew who they were. Allies were known beforehand. Very convenient. Strategy and battle plans published in thick volumes up on the shelf. Come as you are, no evolutions or change. Poland can't stand up in the middle of conflict and say, I'd like to switch sides. Not possible. Single hand of poker. Static time frame. The world will stay frozen. You'll fight it out, and then you'll figure out the change in the international security environment. This is the classic planning paradigm of the military when I came into this business, 1990. The classics of the genre, obviously the Fulda Gap, and then the mini-me version, the DMZ in Korea, which we still have. Now let's talk about the 1990s and a very different beast that we encounter then. We call this the post-Cold War horizontal scenario. Rather than some dramatic thing that happens one day, it's this peaks and valleys mess that we keep dealing with. Sort of like my allergies. The description's here. No clear beginning or end. Drags on forever. Can anybody name the year the Balkans conflict began? I think it was 1262. Definition of who the enemy is changes over time. We went into Somalia, it was clear who the enemy was. It was famine. Then it was those nasty warlords. Then it was that one nasty warlord. Then it was the UN, and we got the hell out of there. Allies come and go, not just the French. That is always the biggest laugh. And I really like it. Strategy evolves, strikes, not battles. We saw that in Afghanistan. Definition of the problem, subject to whatever op-ed you're reading that morning. World goes on. Meanwhile, you babysit this crappy situation on the margins of globalization. The classics of this genre, The Black Knight from Monty Python's Holy Grail, Milosevic, fights on even as we lop off parts of his body. He stands now stumpless in a docket, still spitting at us to come at him one more time. And then, of course, keeping Saddam in the box. That's half the military business in the 1990s. Half of it. No matter how you count it, it's half of what your market was in the 1990s. 2 crappy babysitting jobs on the margins of globalization. But really important. Notice I don't draw one for Central Africa. 3 million dead, over a dozen countries involved. Why not? It doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter. Now. Eventually, I say, somebody will make us understand why it matters. But for now, it doesn't matter. So the concept of the system perturbation is a combination of those 2 concepts. In effect, and we're going to talk about pain here, time along the bottom, it's the massive vertical shock to the system followed by some number, any unlimited number, of horizontal tails. Obviously, the vertical shock here was 9/11 itself. The world came to a standstill. Guys didn't propose to their girlfriends for marriage. Houses weren't bought. Deals were called off. It all slowed down to a nothing for about 6 days. That's how long it took for us to recover. That was our worst case prediction for Y2K. We thought it had to be massive software failures all over the world, not just take down 2 towers in Manhattan. But that was a vulnerability we didn't understand yet. The horizontal tails, obviously, what happened to the airline industry? What happens to the financial markets when the New York Stock Exchange finally comes back online after almost 5 days off? The fellow traveler, we think, the anthrax scare, we go back and forth on this, to whether this was someone just taking advantage or whether this was really part of the whole plot. Another great example, Afghanistan. Tell me when that conflict's going to end. Tell me when that's going to be over. Tell me that isn't going to go up and down for as long as the eye can see. Additional horizontal tails that come off that. Obviously, the tourism industry was hit badly by the airline industry. Financial, you had the reinsurance crisis that lingers to this day. Insurance companies can't get reinsurance from their reinsurers for catastrophic terrorism. Congress promises next week to finally deal with the issue. But in effect, we as a country don't have catastrophic commercial property insurance for terrorism right now. We are hanging out there. We talk about anthrax leading to cheaper AIDS drugs in Africa, and you say, whoa, how did that jump happen? Let me tell you the story. Whether anthrax was a fellow traveler, somebody just jumping on the bandwagon, or whether it was part of the plot, this is how it went down. American public got freaked out. 5 dead, about 20 sick. At that point, the Canadian government tells Bayer Pharmaceutical, the German giant pharmaceutical company, we want all the Cipro you can make for us at cut rate prices or we're going to break your patent in Canada. Charles Schumer, the senator from New York, says we should do the same thing in this country. The Bush administration, to their credit, says basically, we don't think we need to take that step at this time. Bayer got the hint. They produced all the Cipro we want as cheap as possible. At that point, a bunch of countries in sub-Saharan Africa raised their hand and said, wait a minute. We've been asking for patent relief on AIDS cocktail drugs for years. I got millions dead on my continent. You got 5 people dead, 20 sick. Give us a break here. And they made their case very vehemently. And you know what? It was such a deal maker when the Doha round, when the Doha meeting occurred in Qatar, the WTO meeting, the World Trade Organization meeting, that what resulted from that deal being struck on lowering patents for AIDS drugs in Africa is that not only did they have a Doha meeting, but they initiated an entire round based on that meeting, which nobody was predicting for the WTO prior to that meeting. But something really amazing happened on AIDS drugs. That happened because of the anthrax scare. That happened because of 9/11. All that happened because bin Laden decided to do something. All that amazing change. Down in Afghanistan, we have an obvious horizontal scenario. In Pakistan, the Mountain Lion operation that's going on now. We're talking about a near war between India and Pakistan that came about because of the 12/11 terrorist attack against the parliament there. Occurred in an entirely different frame of reference because of 9/11. I spent some time with the President, Prime Minister, Defense Secretary of India last February. They told me Americans do not understand how bad Pakistan really was. And they said, when the streetcar comes down the street, we're going to hop on it, we're going to take advantage of it, we're going to show you how bad these guys really are. That streetcar was 9/11. We came closer to a nuclear exchange than I think this world realizes. And a nuclear exchange between India and Pakistan could have brought in China, could have brought in the United States, and you start looking at scenarios that until that moment looked nuts, all of a sudden start to look a lot more plausible. And then obviously we got a horizontal scenario developing in the stands. We're building temporary military bases throughout the stands. They're going to be about as temporary as the bases we put in Europe and in Northeast Asia at the end of World War II. They're going to stay there for decades. On top of that, you see some old wounds reopened. Israel PLO. All of a sudden, that's a huge horizontal tail here. Somehow connected to all this with Saudi Arabia, where the hijackers came from. And then the anthrax. Is that linked to Iraq? Does that become a rationale for us ultimately going into Iraq? And all of a sudden, you see all sorts of scenarios spinning out because one guy made a decision to do that attack on 9/11. We gave him all that power because this is the response pattern we've mustered. But he lit the charge. He started the trigger. So the definition of the system perturbation we're working on, an international security order thrown into a state of some confusion by a perversely shocking development centered somewhere in the increasingly interconnected global economy. This vertical shock creates horizontal waves. You would imagine they might be dampened by sectoral boundaries. In some senses, they may create positive feedback loops and get even more amplified, to the point where seemingly every rule set is somehow disturbed, knocked out of equilibrium, somehow rearranged. I'm talking how US foreign policy with every country in the world was somehow altered by 9/11. Nobody was talking about, except for me, Russia joining NATO prior to 9/11. In fact, when I would say NATO is going to admit Russia in the next 5 years, people would call me a nut. They're going to sign an agreement on my birthday, May 28th. They're going to become a de facto member, in every sense of the word, of NATO. That came about because of 5 months of negotiation that came right off the heels of 9/11. We're cutting that deal because that was the price Putin asked for Russia's help in the global war on terrorism. Bin Laden decides to do this thing on 9/11. Russia joins NATO. Absolutely amazing. This flexing of the system is temporary, but it's path-dependent, it's chaotic. End states encompass the return of old rules. We're right back to watching violent, apocalyptic TV and movies. The rise of entirely new rule sets like the Office of Homeland Security, and the merging of old and new like Russia joining NATO. The real danger in my mind is this flexing of the international system caused by this sort of system perturbation. This is where real war can start. When you see a United States and a China starting to come to heads, I may predict, over how we're choosing to deal with Central Asia, when they, for a very long time, had their own sense of how Central Asia should be organized. They had a special Shanghai Cooperation Council with all the major powers in the region. As soon as 9/11 happens, the United States barges onto the scene, says, "Thank you, China, very much. You've done a wonderful job so far. We're running the show from now on." Competing rule sets. So the ordering principle and how we think this concept of system perturbation might inform our sense of transformation, where we should go as a military. The concept of the ordering principle, I'll define it simply as The core conflict model around which all is planned, procured, organized, trained, operated, and incentivized within DoD. What we're talking about here is that transformation needs some sort of point in the future that we can target. We're talking about transforming 10% of our force every year. In what direction do we go? We think 9/11 has taught us that change in the international security environment can come in a much broader and more complex way than just military conflict. And we think we have to adjust to that. Not just DoD, the entire national security establishment. So where are we in this process? In terms of an ordering principle, what we had in the Cold War, we had an ordering principle called Great Power War. The core concept here was World War III with the Soviets, strategic nuclear exchange, major armies fighting it out in Europe. That's what we organized around. Below that, on the level of the nation state, we had proxy wars. It wasn't what we optimized for. We were careful never to fight the Soviets head on. Down here at the bottom, the level of the individual, we had what's so-called lesser includeds, terrorists, narco, drug traffickers, transnational criminals. Now you come, and up here, the Great Power War, that was the ordering principle. That's what we optimized for, even though this was about 90% of what we did. We come to the 1990s, Soviet threat goes away. We don't have a system-level conflict model anymore. So we try to backfill. We developed this concept of 2 major theater wars equal a Great Power War. We used to have the old 10-foot-tall Soviet threat. We replaced them with 2 5-foot-tall threats, North Korea and Iraq. And if you stacked them end on end, stared at them in the darkness, they almost looked like the old Soviet 10-foot threat. Sort of like 2 midgets wearing a really long top coat. Down here, I like to say everybody got a promotion. I'm not just a terrorist, I'm a transnational actor. Someday I hope to be a super empowered individual. Up here, we tried to backfill with the concept of the near peer competitor, or as I like to call it, China all grown up. But this is what we sold the public. Les Aspin's bottom-up review, the ordering principle, 2 MTWs. The question is, what's the ordering principle now? We got some competition. Down here at the level of the individual, there are a lot of Americans who think Homeland Security should be the organizing principle for DoD. That may shock some of us, but they pay $400 billion a year. They don't want to watch 3,000 Americans die on television every other week. And if you tell them, hey, all I do is Afghanistan, all I do is take down governments way across the world, they're probably not going to be happy enough with that answer. But that's too narrow. On the level of the nation state, some people say this global war on terrorism, going country by country around the world, that could be an organizing principle. Well, we don't think that's enough. We think America is a system-level power, has to have a system-level concept. So what we're proposing is this concept of system perturbation. We say if you can handle all the threats, all the notions encompassed by this system perturbation concept, we think you can handle all this, including Great Power War, because we think you can prevent Great Power War by mastering this larger concept, which of course is much bigger than just DoD. The conversation we have had again and again on this subject, frankly, it was a conversation that Zabrowski had with Paul Wolfowitz, Deputy Secretary of Defense, when he presented these concepts a few weeks back. And it's a conversation we have again and again, and it's a useful conversation. Basically, we say, just to be cheeky, 9/11 changes everything. And what the argument is that we're making here is, hey, system perturbations on top, Great Power War, now the lesser included, which sounds like heresy, frankly. People say, hey, it's not like we can forget about China. We can't go running around chasing these system perturbators. We got to worry about the big countries like a China. So we answer, well, great, let's go catch bin Laden. We'll go right back to planning for the Taiwan Straits. In effect, arguing, hey, you could say Great Power War still on top. System perturbation, this concept of killing Americans live on national television, lesser included. Don't bother me, I'm DoD, I only do the big things. I don't think that sells. So they say, hey, that sounds a little much. Then what? Maybe we plan for both. And this is basically Andy Marshall's concept. You fence off the old force, you let it atrophy, you build the new force 10% a year. The question is, what are you building towards? And what we're talking about is this concept of system perturbation. What we're really arguing here is that this is the greater inclusive. Before 9/11, we had this organizing principle. It was Great Power War. We had all the lesser includeds in there. The basic argument was it took a great power war to generate change in the strategic environment. Three big changes, 20th century. World War I, World War II, end of the Cold War. I say we had real structural change in the global security environment on the basis of 9/11. So eventually we're going to come to understand that there's a bigger concept for rule set change. What we call it is system perturbation. Doesn't mean great power war still isn't important. Doesn't mean it's any smaller a threat. It means it has to be viewed within a larger context. Because our argument is it takes a system perturbation. All it takes is a system perturbation to enact serious change in the international security environment. And it's during that fluxing of the security environment where the possibility of great power war becomes a lot more realistic. So mastering system perturbation is what allows you to prevent this kind of conflict down the road. Transformation, and the questions we ask regarding this new concept of crisis. We ask, does 9/11 serve as an existent proof for the concept of system perturbation? Some people say, no, this is not a new crisis. It's only a supercrime. Catch the supercriminal, this game is over. The arguments we hear from this crowd is, hey, transformation, you don't have to go very far up the chain. Transform the sinks. Turn them all into JADF East. Lots of interagency. Add a liaison from every national security agency you can find. That's all you need to do. That's all the transformation that's required. If you say yes, we ask the second question. Can system perturbations equal a new ordering principle? Are there new rules appearing in the international security environment? Some people will say absolutely not. We only do nation states, DOD. One guy from ONR, when I gave the talk there, Office of Naval Research, said, you know, my great power war paradigm military kicked ass in Afghanistan. I don't see any reason to change. My response was, if you think DOD's responsibility is only to go beat up on Afghanistan after 9/11, I don't think you got the big picture in mind. Because I think, again, the American public's going to demand more. So some of those people might argue we'll transform the services, but no higher up the chain. If you say yes, we ask a third question, which is the most interesting one. Can super-empowered individuals, will transnational networks, are they going to be the dominant trigger agent in the new security environment? Are these individuals who are going to start major crises again and again? Whether it's the guy who writes the computer virus, whether it's the technological breakthrough, whether it's a transnational insurgency like Al-Qaeda, which creates serious economic dislocation because they ram a couple of planes into a building. In effect, are newcomers defining the rules? Some people will say with great vehemence, no, states still rule the crisis paradigm. And if we become fixated on super-empowered individuals, transnational networks, we'll make the same mistake that England made at the end of the 19th century when they became fixated on protecting their global empire, didn't see the rising threat, German land power. So they may go as far as transforming DOD, but if you answer yes to all these questions, you breathe the same rare air as Art Zebrowski, and you say, we got to have a transformation process in place. We got to be able to handle any sort of crisis that comes along, anything that perturbs the global system. Because ultimately, we're no longer just a Leviathan preventing wars between nation states. Increasingly, we're a system administrator, interested in keeping globalization up and running as much as possible. It's not just enough to keep the bad guys out. We got to keep the system running, and defense is part of that. So let me wrap up on this point. Transformation, as defined by Art Zebrowski again and again. Three key pillars. A lot of people talk about buying equipment as if that's transformation only. A lot of people talk about running DOD better, but of course that's a whole lot more than making the checks go out faster. Finally, he adds a third point, a reevaluation of the role of DOD in national security. What is the 9/11 effect? The argument I'm making here is, I think buying new equipment becomes less important. It's not the technology we bring, it's how we use it. I think how we run DOD, especially our relationships with other parts of the US government, with the rest of the world's militaries, becomes a much larger and more important endeavor. I think a reevaluation of the role of DOD and national security becomes absolutely huge. It's going to be a dominant question. We're going to be wrestling with it for a very long time. Let me end on that note, and I'd be happy to take your questions at this point. Please.
You didn't tell us about the companion to all this that has to be going on in connection with trying to improve the world so that all of this tenderness and reaction can be lessened. Could you give us a comment on that?
Yes. Actually, it's about 20 slides down the road. But I don't want to keep you here all night. In effect, I think that we have to view the functioning of globalization as 4 major flows, okay? I'm going to distinguish between the core and the gap, okay? The 4 major flows that must occur. People have to move from the gap to the core. We're going to top out as a global population between 9 and 10 billion 2050. Then we begin to depopulate as a species. Absolute turning point in human history. 2050, the old in the world begin to outnumber the young. 65 and older outnumber 15 and under. First time in human history. About 2 billion in each category. The trick is, most of the young are going to be in the gap. Most of the old are going to be in the core. To maintain worker-retiree ratios, you got to have those people move. That has got to happen. It's the release valve in the system of globalization. If you fight a war on global terrorism and stop that movement of people, you will create a pressure buildup, you will create violence. Absolutely. That's flow number 1. Flow number 2, we are going to be exporting security into Southwest Asia for half a century. You say, that's unbelievable, American public won't stand for it, this is unprecedented, we have no success at this kind of stuff. Don't kid yourself. We exported security into Europe for 50 years. We were immensely successful at that. They said it could never happen. The French, like the Germans, Russia, to be weighted out as a threat. We managed it. We managed to demilitarize Japan by exporting security into Northeast Asia for a long time. We're doing the same thing, I could argue, with China, allowing them to concentrate on development, being the glue of security in Asia. We're going to be exporting security from the core to the gap, from United States to Southwest Asia, for half a century. That's got to happen. There's so much pain there. 2 flows. Third flow, energy has got to come out of the gap to developing Asia. Developing Asia surpasses North America as the demand center of the global energy market in the next 10 to 15 years. Right now, North America, about 1/3 of the global energy demand. We've been the demand center for so long, we can't imagine anything else. In 20 years, developing Asia, China, India, and whatnot, will become the demand center of the global energy market. They already consume 65% of all the oil that's produced and exported out of the Persian Gulf. In 2010, they're going to consume 75%. Okay? That energy's got to go from Southwest, Central Asia, natural gas and oil, to developing Asia. 3rd flow. 4th flow, lots of finance, lots of investment have to flow from the 2 great centers of money in the world, Europe and the United States, towards developing Asia, to finance all the infrastructure, all that development. Okay, those are 4 transactions I've implied. Okay? We're trading our opportunity for their ambition, that's the flow of people. We're trading our security to contain their pain. That's the flow of exportation of security from the United States to Southwest Asia. They're trading their energy for our prosperity. We need Asia as trade partners. They need the energy to flow. We enable that with our security. And we're trading our money and buying off developing Asia's long-term threat. We buy off the Chinese threat. Those 4 flows have got to happen for globalization to function over the next 50 years. Anything we do that threatens one threatens the others. That'll get you the development. That'll get you the ability to deal with environmental degradation. That'll keep everything relatively cool. Won't make it perfect, but it'll allow globalization to shrink the gap as much as possible over time. And then 2050, we begin to depopulate, and we live in a different environment. That's my view. Another question, please.
A follow-up. It's 1 and 4, the movement from the gap to the core and transferring finance and investment to the gap. On both those, over the last 50 years, we've done a very bad job. Any comment on that?
Yeah. I mean, there was a golden moment when there was so much money sloshing around. I mean, if you look at the beginning of the 1990s, public aid to developing countries was 5 to 1 the number of private foreign direct investment flow. Okay, you look at the end of the 1990s, foreign direct investment to emerging economies, 5 times the flow of official developmental aid. Okay, but most of that went to developing Asia. Most of it, frankly, went to China. There was a golden moment there in the mid-1990s when there was a surfeit of money flowing even to Africa, if you can believe it. And things looked really bright there for a while. But the violence became endemic. The structures there couldn't handle it. Perfect example, Madagascar, very recently, was attracting all sorts of investment. Textile industries, their political system produced 2 guys who claimed to be president after the election. Compare that to what happened in this country. Okay? Nothing happened in this country economically. That scared all the money out of Madagascar. Okay? And that place fell apart. Okay, so the rule sets have to be there for the money to flow. Where the rule sets are being developed right now for the money to flow is developing Asia. I could argue we export so much security there in form of naval presence. We allow governments to concentrate on their economic development, to create the rule sets, to attract the money. Like a China joining the WTO and saying, I want to belong to your rule set. But that's not happening in the really bad parts of the world that I call the non-integrating gap. One, because they're just so darn poor in Africa. They don't have the political systems. And in Southwest Asia, it's absolutely amazing. They've gotten all this money from energy. They've done almost nothing with it. Saudi Arabia, 20 years ago, had a per capita income $28,600. It was like the Jed Clampett effect. Looking for some food, he had bubbling crude. All of a sudden, their population doubles. Per capita income in that country right now, about $7,000. 65% of the population under 25. They're going to be below $3,000 per capita a year in 10 years, I predict. That was a country that was in the upper income bracket, then the upper middle. In 10 years, it'll be in the lower middle. And guess what? That's the bracket where you start to see violence. So we have some real problems emerging. The only way we're going to fix it in terms of getting money to those places that are really endemic in terms of conflict is to go in and export, in effect, security there. We're not willing to do it in Africa yet. We are willing to do it in Southwest Asia. We have been willing to do it, and I would say quite effectively, in developing Asia for 30 years now. Please? Sir.
You linked 9/11 to the globalization core and gap, but didn't bin Laden say it was a cultural, religious thing that Americans are in Saudi Arabia? And if we're in Saudi Arabia to protect the flow of oil, don't we need to focus our extensive resources and capital on finding an alternative energy source to reduce our reliance completely, world's reliance completely on oil, if possible?
Right. No argument on what bin Laden wants. He wants Saudi Arabia. The reason why he can't have Saudi Arabia is there's too much energy there. We could accept a disruption in this country and probably get away with it. We get about 3 to 4% of our energy comes from the Persian Gulf. If you read the New York Times, Washington Post, you would swear our entire economy was run on oil and all of it came from Saudi Arabia. 3 to 4% of what we burn for energy, all our energy in this world, in this country, comes from the Persian Gulf. We could get by without the Persian Gulf. Who could not get by is developing Asia. And there's no way they're making that jump to those kinds of technologies. It would just be too darn disruptive. You're talking half the world's population. I cannot write that off under any circumstances. What bin Laden wants to do, he says, all I wants to take Saudi Arabia off the map. He wants to take a lot more than that off the map. We've seen this kind of threat before. First time last century, Vladimir Lenin. He said, I want to take Russia off the map. And he did. He took them off the global economy map for 70 years. Mao did the same thing with China. They all suffered dramatically because of it. None of us had the opportunity to have that economic development, to make those profits. For a long time, the wall comes down, everybody's on the same play sheet. That is a tremendous opportunity. I say we can't let any of that slip away again. And as much as possible, we can't let the non-integrating gap get any bigger than possible. In many ways, it's an imperial policy. It's like late Roman Empire. We're going to put legions all around that non-functioning gap, and we're going to try to squeeze it over time, which is why we're rushing all sorts of resources into the stands right now, because we do not want it spreading up towards Russia. But I think this is a cultural argument, by and large, with bin Laden. He wants us, our way of life, our content flows, he wants all of that out of his world. And it's just too valuable. I mean, if he was the head of the Congo and said the same thing, and some have there, in effect, we wouldn't care, because there's nothing that comes out of there that we need. Please.
Lieutenant Commander Dicey, citing the near equivalent of Russia joining NATO,
Right.
and our need to focus on your gap with our national security strategy, does that support a position where the United States should withdraw from NATO?
Absolutely not. My argument is, and I wrote this as early as 1990, you know, that old Baker-Shevardnadze dream, Vancouver, Vladivostok, you know, kind of a northern hemispheric security zone. I want it. I want Russia in NATO, and as soon as I get Russia in NATO, I want to get China in NATO. I want to get Japan in a NATO. I want to create the alliance structure so that the next time a real destabilizing event comes out of that nasty gap, that everybody in the Corps knows which side of the bread their butter goes, in effect. I want all that stuff built in so we handle the next 9/11, because I think there's going to be lots of 9/11s over the course of my life. I want us to handle it with aplomb because we know exactly who to call. It's all been prearranged. Okay? What we saw with 9/11 is all the countries that are moving towards globalization kind of bunched up and became friendlier. All the countries that are kind of having a hard time with globalization, they all kind of bunched up. Okay? Countries in the middle, like a China and a Russia, they had to choose. Tom Friedman said, in effect, you're choosing between Lexus world or olive tree world. Russia raised its hand very quickly. It said, what do you want? I want to be part of the Lexus world. China said the same thing. Iran didn't. Saudi Arabia hasn't. I think the selections, the choices we saw out of countries immediately after 9/11 told us which direction they're moving. Please.
September 11th, a guy in a cave, 19 guys on planes have imposed multi-trillion-dollar tax,
Right.
security, and some of it driven by insecurity, paranoia, people not moving, and so forth. What happens if you just said we could have another number of 9/11s? A dirty bomb goes off nuclear bomb in center of New York City, a series of things like that.
Right.
What would happen now at our state of development and readiness if we have 4 or 5 things like this over the next 6 to 12 months, and is that a possibility?
Or the next 6 to 12 years. I mean, you take down something really huge, you create 200,000 dead with a smallpox outbreak or something like that in Cincinnati. You create real fear and panic in this country. It wouldn't be that hard, unfortunately. One of the immediate results, I think, would be it would not be called the Office of Homeland Security anymore. It would be called the Department of Homeland Security. I wrote a piece from U.S. Naval Institute Proceedings, and it was triggered by an email I got from Art Sabrowski right after Y2K was a dud. He said, in effect, I'm concerned that this big security issue came and went, and the people who handled it most were the private sector. And DOD was not a player in this at all. And I'm concerned that this is the future of conflict and danger in a networked world, and we're not part of it, really. It was much more private sector. It was much more other parts of the U.S. government. And in this article I wrote for Proceedings, I imagined an electronic Pearl Harbor, in effect, a real stunning, shocking development. And one of the things I said could happen was you could see a Back to the Future outcome. Before the Cold War, we had 2 military departments. We had a Department of Navy, which I could call a network enabling force, all our connectivity and commerce with the outside world, defined primarily by the seas at that point. And we had a Department of War, a big stick force that we only brought out when we had to put the whoop on somebody. Okay? We merged those 2 concepts into a single department, DOD, 1947 Defense Act, because we said we're going to be in a hair-trigger standoff with the Soviets ad infinitum. Okay? That comes and goes 50 years later. And you start to see movement within the US government, calls, in effect, to bifurcate DoD, to take all the non-warfighting capacity, what we call military operations other than war, and kind of migrate them towards some sort of new network security kind of force. You saw that in the Hart-Rudman Commission. You've seen that in all sorts of commissions and concepts where they come out basically saying, wouldn't it be neat if we could unite all the customs and FBI and the Coast Guard and all these things, put them into a new package. That's basically what happened in embryonic form, Office of Homeland Security. The first thing they want to do is take as much as they can of this newly defined national security paradigm and bring it in to a non-military function. And DoD can say, hey, we're only about nation states, we don't care about any of that, but I say your market is being lifted from you every day of the week. And over time, that's a real danger if we're not part of this larger security definition. It worries me if DoD is only good for fighting wars that we don't fight anymore, in effect, great power wars, and has to be optimized on the fly all the time to do what is really this new sort of warfare. I mean, it's absolutely amazing when we go into these caves and there are FBI agents coming right in with us to interrogate these guys. I mean, I'd never heard of that before. Or CIA operatives pulling the trigger on the Hellfire missiles coming out of the Predator drones. That is amazing connectivity, amazing jointness in a whole new way. I worry that the more we see this kind of violence, the more we'll see a bifurcation of our security structure, much like they have in Israel, where you have a Ministry of the Interior that's almost as strong and as profound a force in security as their military arm. And I think that would be a bad course for the US, because to the extent they force us to play the home game, we get out of the business of exporting security. That is the one great public sector good we provide the planet. We live large. How we pay for living large in this world is by exporting security. Please.
Yes, sir. I'm really interested in your feelings on the role of DoD in Homeland Security. There's another school of thought that maintains that defense is by its own nature external.
Right.
And we've learned some tough lessons in the past for having military troops intervene in anything within the United States. States are holding well to their own rights. It's a bottom-up society. We run in a top-down society. And security is by its own nature internal. How are we going to rectify the difference between how states view this, which they're very much anti-DoD involvement, and the DoD's feeling that they need to become more involved?
Right. I mean, I've seen these in all the exercises they had. We had one here, Exercise Hope for Rhode Island. They have one of these scary scenarios for a domestic biochem or terrorist strike. And it's the same thing. It's a 2-day exercise. The casualties pile up. And by the time the exercise ends, everybody says, you know, we're totally swamped. We're really going to be wiped out by this. But they never get to the point of actually having the discussion of, hey, you're the military, you're right here, what are you going to do to help us? And the military, by and large, isn't interested in having that conversation, to be honest. Every time I've seen these exercises, and I saw it with the Y2K exercises, the bases basically say, we got to take care of our own, we got to stay strong for the away game, we don't want to be caught up in this. I say those walls got to come down, okay? That's the first point. But by and large, I prefer to see our military play the away game as much as possible, but it's going to be a very different away game if it includes Treasury, FBI, CIA, and all the ways that we're seeing now. It's a really different game, and I don't think we're built for that kind of connectivity. I don't think we're structured internally in DoD to have those kinds of conversations with Congress. I think the notion that intelligence is going to serve two masters at the same time, this Office of Homeland Security and the military abroad, is dangerous. So I think there's a lot of walls that got to come down. To the extent possible, I want to see DoD stay out of the domestic game, because I think our massive strength in this country is that we're ultimately a supremely distributed system, very robust first responders, very robust law enforcement. There's a choice you make between bolstering the immune system, working the membrane, sort of the FBI and the Coast Guard, keeping the dangerous people out at the borders, versus creating an antiseptic environment over there. As much as possible, creating that antiseptic environment around the world, it's a great goal. There's only so much you can do on it. Okay, so to a certain extent, we have to help out at home. But by and large, I'd like to see us, as much as possible, stay out of that business. That's probably not a very good answer, but That's the best I can do. One more? Please, sir.
I haven't heard you mention the role of Special Operations Forces, SOCOM, and Navy SEAL teams, and that.
Right.
I mean, that's what they're designed to do. And
right.
I just wonder if you'd comment on that.
I did mention it in terms of that one slide where I talked about the kind of a special ops warfare fought, cave by cave and whatnot. A couple of insights. When I did the Y2K work and went around and briefed all the commands that I could, the one command that I got all the way up to the sync on was Special Operations Command. They were so interested in this. They looked at the paradigm, the crisis model, and they said, that's the future. Okay? It doesn't surprise me that they were used extensively in this war in Afghanistan. You could argue that 20% of US military resources fought about 80% of that war. And so one answer is to say, hey, I've seen the future, it's at 20%, let's build it up. And I really like that argument. We had somebody in here last week said, the Department of Navy has something like 1.5 times as many lawyers as SEALs and 2 times as many chaplains as SEALs. There's something really messed up. Okay? Let me give you another example here. Cantor Fitzgerald, the firm that we interacted with on the New Rule Sets project, they turned a profit in the 4th quarter of last year. Cantor Fitzgerald, which lost 2/3 of its personnel in its headquarters in New York, turned a profit in the 4th quarter. How did they do it? They had already created within their organization a cannibalizing element. It was called eSpeed. They told eSpeed, an electronic version of the classic guys calling on the phone, typing it in model, to steal as much business from Cantor Fitzgerald, the old paradigm, as possible, so that that internal organization could cannibalize the larger organization before somebody else figured out, cracked the code, and beat them to that new market. Okay? They survived because when all those suits, in effect, were killed, they could shift over to eSpeed. They had a cannibalizing agent in place. If I identify a cannibalizing agent within DoD, I would cite SOCOM. That's the group I would feed as much as possible over the next 10 to 20 years. And I would really restrict flows to other people.